Years ago, when I was a rabbi in Birmingham, Alabama, I had read about the Enron debacle. And I read a lot of different articles about what happened and how it happened. Still don't understand. But I noticed somehow something I read explained that one of the people in the upper echelons that was responsible for what went down was a Jewish guy. And so I needed to write a sermon, and the Torah portion happened to lend itself to talking about business ethics. So I thought I would write this man, anonymous man, a letter. That would be my sermon about the rules of Jewish business practice. And maybe I might have said something like, if you had been paying attention in Hebrew school, maybe you would have done better. I talked about the rules about how we should engage in business practices in general, with transparency. Jewish law teaches about our responsibility for returning lost items to people who have lost them and not charging them for them. Jewish law regarding paying our employees in a timely way. Jewish laws, for example, which interestingly don't start out to be business, but become a way of understanding how we engage in business. And that is, when you lose your ox, right? Because that happens to you, right? People owned beasts of burden, and they would own an ox. And an ox, when they're not behaving well, they can do some damage. Oxes have a bad habit of goring things that are near them. And if, the Torah says, if your ox, while it's not under your supervision, or even if it is, the ox gores someone and even causes their death, this is the first time it's ever happened, then you, the owner, are responsible for compensatory damages. However, if your ox had gored before, and the Torah says, mitamol shilshom, in the past, well, now you have a record. Now you've been warned. And so if your ox gored someone and killed them again, killed someone else again, not only would the ox be put down, but you would have to pay with your life. So this is what the Torah describes, and then from it is a whole world of Jewish law regarding how we should engage in business practices. Now, in 2011, we moved to Houston. And I was hearing someone talk about Enron, and I said, oh, right. I wrote a fictional letter to this guy who I knew was Jewish, and they said, oh, yeah, well, his family belongs at this congregation. I said, oh, good. Terrific. Those of you who know. So I learned my lesson very clearly. It was very clear. I learned my lesson. I knew that the next time something like this would come up, I would just need to make sure that I had a congregation with no membership. Because today I'm going to talk just a little bit about another company owned by a Jewish family that's been in the news. You may have heard of them, Purdue Pharmaceuticals. You've probably heard of them? Yeah. So as of today, Purdue Pharmaceuticals has been hit with as much as $6 billion in compensatory damages. Of course, the details of how everything ultimately is going to be ironed out in the end, their responsibility, what they're liable for, etc., will be worked out. But the really interesting thing about Purdue Pharmaceuticals is something I learned recently. I am a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell. And he has a podcast called Revisionist History. And he talks in in the past year, a piece about what he calls triplicate. So if you are a doctor, you're probably familiar with this idea. That is, certain level pharmaceuticals, certain level of addictive pharmaceuticals such as opioid medications, have a certain level, certain requirement, and turns out in 5 states, triplicate was required, is still required, to write these prescriptions. So what is triplicate? The doctor has to buy the prescription pad, and then he writes the prescription, and it goes on 3 layers. 1, the doctor keeps in his office, has to keep on record for 2 years. 1, the pharmacist keeps on record for 2 years, and 1 is sent to a state office, kept on record for at least 2 years. And here's what his research found. That in these 5 states, which happen to be California, Idaho, Illinois, New York, and Texas, in these 5 states, the degree of opioid overdose and deaths was significantly lower than the other states in the country. And this is borne out by Purdue Pharmaceuticals' own records. It was working so well, this triplicate requirement, that when Purdue was launching OxyContin, they chose not to pursue heavy PR efforts in these 5 states. These are quotes from Purdue's own field studies. The triplicate laws seem to have a dramatic effect on the product usage behavior of the physicians. The mere thought of the government questioning their judgment created a high level of anxiety in the focus group room among the doctors. Purdue looked at that high level of anxiety and asked, is it even worth marketing OxyContin in triplicate states? Now, I'm not here as an expert on Purdue Pharmaceuticals, but as I listened to this and then did the research, it reminded me so much of a phrase from that prayer we prayed this morning, Unetana Tokef, the one where it goes, who will live and who will die? But towards the end it says, in truth, you are judge and plaintiff, counselor and witness. You inscribe and seal. You record and recount. You remember all that we have forgotten. And when you open the book of memories, it speaks for itself. For every human hand leaves its mark, an imprint like no other. I know that we are often not drawn near by the notion of Big Brother is watching, or Big Sister, or Big Sibling. But perhaps in certain cases, it's really effective. It's really helpful. And our liturgy reminds us, not from the idea that we will necessarily be judged with reward or punishment by the deeds that are remembered, but that all that we do, all that we say, every word we choose to say or don't, every email we furiously write at midnight but don't send or do. Every time our hand closes in a fist or opens into a handshake. Every moment of our lives, we are creating our own record. The prayer is a reminder that we own our words and our deeds. Yes, there are lots of causes that can cause us to do things, and we can blame others, and we can blame moments, and we can blame circumstances, yes. But part of the work of being a human being is, as I said last week, lengthening that fuse. But this book of memories is who we are. Now, this isn't to say that when you do something bad or awful or mean, that you should just feel so awful and that all is lost. None of us are perfect. But our desire, our tendency to only accept the good stuff and reject the bad, well, not only is it not effective in human growth, but it's not true. We are the sum total of all that we've said and done in our lives, and all that we've chosen not to say and not to do in our lives. On this very day, on Yom Kippur, thousands of years ago, the Kohen HaGadol would gather the Israelites at the ancient temple and would bring before him 2 goats. And he would cast lots for which goat would be the offering to Adonai, burnt on the altar, and which goat would be sent out to Azazel, the wilderness. Now, I'd like to frankly be the goat that went to Azazel, but or maybe you'll think otherwise. The goat that goes to Adonai remains pure and without blemish, physically and spiritually. But the goat that is sent out to Azazel, upon its shoulders are placed all of the weight of the sins of the Jewish people. That on this day of Yom Kippur, we are cleansed of those sins, and the weight of them is now upon this goat, which is sent out to Azazel. But wouldn't it make more sense if therefore the goat carrying the sins would have been offered up to God? But that's not the way the Torah describes it. The Torah says the goat carrying the sins goes out to Azazel. Well, Azazel, it's probably an ancient term referring to some sort of notion of demons. But the Israelites understood it as the wilderness. And I would like to suggest that it is really our minds and our memories. We engage in these pursuits on Yom Kippur. We seek to be forgiven for our sins. We seek to understand what we've done, why we've done it, and how we can do better. But as Maimonides teaches, the only real, fundamental, and final measure of our process of teshuvah is when we have the chance to do it again and we don't. Not because we're too tired, not because we're too old, but because we say, oh, I'm not going down that path again. And so these memories of our deeds, they are meant to wander in our minds so that we remember. Remember, brought to mind, but also remember. Reconnect ourselves to that action or deed. Not to forever feel guilty, but to continually and regularly be reminded of what we did without rewriting history. With time saying, well, that wasn't really me. That wasn't really what happened. But rather, owning it, recognizing it, embracing it. This space of Azazel, the wilderness, is a space we should seek to nurture, to allow to be a bit wild, to not be so closed off to the possibility of the shame of the deed, but allowing it to take root, not as something that will continue to cause us to act badly, but rather as something that serves as a signpost that we don't want to go there again. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the notion of the triplicate being the chilling effect. This thing, this moment, this experience where the doctors say, oh, I want to be just a bit more careful because I know someone is watching. I know there is a record. And I know that my goal is to bring joy and blessing and health into the world. And I want to work towards making sure that is my legacy more than loss and guilt and shame. May we all allow our Azazels to grow in our minds, not afraid to remember how and when and why we acted badly, so that we don't go down that path again.